We are going to continue our mini-series on the patriarchs and matriarchs of the Bible and look at Hagar and Ishmael. Now, if you missed our videos on Abraham and Sarah, I would recommend checking them out because they lay some groundwork for today's video. Also, if you want more videos like this, make sure you hit subscribe so that you get notified every time we release a new video. Now, up until this point in the story, Sarah and Abraham have been childless for many years. And remember, back then, not having children meant that you were cursed and would not be able to inherit the promises that God made to your family line. So Sarah decides to give her servant Hagar to Abraham so that he can sleep with her and bear children for him. There's another important truth that we need to discuss. And that's the fact that painful detours can lead to divine encounters. You see, Hagar never would have found this spring of water if she had not been running away from her mistress. And it was because of this detour in her life that she was able to meet God. Sometimes when we're going through difficult times in our lives, when things don't go according to plan, we think that God is against us. He sees everything that's happening, and he has a heart for the oppressed. So if you're suffering right now, cry out to God. Let him know what you're going through, and he will either rescue you or give you strength to keep going. But oftentimes those detours in our lives lead us to God. If you enjoyed it, please hit like so that it can reach more people. And if you haven't already, please hit subscribe so that you can join our growing biblical family. And if we're willing to follow him, he'll take us to places that we never could have imagined. And lo and behold, Hagar does indeed get pregnant and has a son named Ishmael. Maybe your marriage isn't going well, or perhaps your business is failing, or maybe you just got diagnosed with a disease. Sarah probably thought that she could hide her mistreatment of Hagar and Ishmael from God. But God had something to say about that. A Jewish woman was hiding from the Nazis in a concentration camp with her baby. And one night as she's rocking her baby to sleep, she hears a voice that says, "Don't worry, I've got you." And she's like, "Who said that?" And then the voice says it again, "Don't worry, I've got you." She looks around to see who said this, but nobody was there. And so she goes back to rocking her baby. But the next day, British commandos come in and rescue her and her baby. And afterwards, she learns that the voice she heard belonged to none other than Lieutenant Colonel John Shirley, the leader of the commando unit. He later said that as his men were planning the raid, he heard this voice that said, "Don't forget the woman with the baby." And he knew that God had laid it on his heart to make sure that they did and overlook anyone during their rescue mission. In fact, in Genesis chapter 21, it says that God heard the voice of the boy. So what this tells us is that God sees what's happening in our world. He sees the oppression of the weak and the suffering of the innocent, and he will do whatever it takes to bring them freedom. Whatever it is that you're going through, know this. God is with you in your suffering. And if you'll allow him, he'll take your pain and turn it into a place of encounter with him. Ishmael is then weaned at the age of 5 years old, and it's at this point that Sarah tells Abraham to get rid of Hagar and Ishmael because she doesn't want them around anymore. And so Abraham takes them out into the wilderness and leaves them there without any water. All right, let's dive into it. Hagar is first introduced in Genesis chapter 16. In fact, in verse 7, it says that an angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness. And he says, "Hagar, slave of the living God, where are you?" Now, this is significant because it shows that God still knew where she was. He hadn't forgotten about her. The Hebrew word for found here actually means to find someone who is lost or hidden. And Hagar was indeed hiding from her mistress, Sarah, and also hiding from her uncertain future. But God didn't want Hagar to live in hiding anymore. He wanted her to know that he saw her and he cared about her. Now Hagar probably thought that her and her son's story was over. She probably thought that God had forgotten about her, that God wasn't done with her yet. Now, most people read this passage and think that God spoke through the angel to Hagar. Thought the Hebrew actually doesn't support that idea. All the text says is that the angel asked her a question. But the interesting thing is that the very next verse says that Hagar did answer the angel, which wouldn't make sense unless she knew who he was and what he wanted. And this leads many scholars to believe that Hagar actually recognized this being as God himself. And if that's true, then this passage gives us an example of God appearing to someone outside of the nation of Israel. And it shows that no one is off limits to God, no matter who you are, where you're from, or what you've done. God is interested in you. But this isn't the only lesson we learn from this passage. So what are some of the difficult detours that you're facing right now? The last lesson we need to learn from this passage is the fact that you are never invisible to God. There's a beautiful story from World War II that illustrates this truth. Friends, never think that God couldn't see what you're going through. And on that note, we're going to end this video.